Strategic media and public relations is bringing together dynamic companies, investors, and consumers like no one before. And we're doing it in a unique way while addressing the big changes underway in our world. Our world is fraught with both peril and opportunity. The world is changing. Long-term conflicts are shaping up over commodities, currencies, and influence. Political lines are shifting. Yet mankind moves on to meet the needs of a growing world. Newer, cleaner energy, medical breakthroughs, ways to better our lives, better ways to move into the future. Join us now for today's topic.
Welcome in. I'm Chris Temple, Vice President of Strategic SMPR and also editor and publisher of the National Investor. And today we want to introduce to you a good buddy of mine. We've known one another for a while now. We'll be bringing him on shortly. His name is Ryan Sistad. He runs Better in Our Backyard. It's based in Duluth, Minnesota. It's a public interest organization that I ran across a few years ago. I reached out to Ryan, and we've been buddies ever since. Try and play golf once or twice in the summer when I'm up in his neck of the woods for the summertime. And he's doing a really, really good work. And that work chiefly involves waking up as many of our fellow citizens as possible to the fact, as the name implies of his organization, that we would be better off building in our own backyard the electric vehicles, the infrastructure, the power grids, and everything that we need for the future, rather than relying on imports, which we all know we do to one extent or another. When I first learned about Ryan, it really hit home to me because having lived for a long time up in the upper Midwest and Northwest Wisconsin, of course, specifically, as many of you know, being in close proximity to the Iron Range, I followed that region for a very, very long time. In fact, believe it or not, it is a quarter of a century this month since I first went and visited what's called the North Met Project back in June of 1999. It just doesn't seem possible that much time has gone by, but it has. And I was turned on to this idea by a subscriber of mine who I saw regularly for cocktails in the evening in one of my past lives where I was back and forth to Washington all the time. I would see this subscriber regularly, and he knew I had just moved to Spooner, Wisconsin back in the late 90s and said, "Hey, I want you to go check out this play for me." One of the other newsletters I get was talking about this. It's a big battery metals project. It's in the Iron Range mining area and so on and so forth. So I went there, kicked the tires, got to know the company over a period of time, recommended them for a spell. Our subscribers made a lot of money on them. But over the years, even though they maintain a good public presence, the former Polymet, which now has been completely bought out by Glencore. The local entity is now known as North Range Copper and Nickel. But they've been working to get permitted and get back into production one of the largest development stage battery metals project in the U.S. And again, they've been very evangelical about it. I was even quite pleased that some years back they allowed me to come on a private tour with some of my family, as I'm trying to get the next generation or two interested in what's going on in the Iron Range and in our own backyard. So I had my daughter here and her sons. I've had others of my family up there to Polymet, as well as other projects in the area, to educate them of what the history is of the region that they live in. And of course, many of you know that the Iron Range supplied the lion's share of the steel that built America in the Industrial Revolution. And these days, it is very important potentially for all of the nickel and cobalt and copper and other things that we need for infrastructure and for green energy and so forth down the road. But it's been kind of slow in coming. And so a while back, I ran across Ryan. He had been seeded, if you will, to start Better in Our Backyard. He's a go-getter, as you're going to learn, very passionate about the Iron Range and the people there as well. And Ryan, glad to have you on board today.
Yeah, thank you for having me again, Chris. And as always, it's fun to build on our relationship and continue these interviews and just really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Well, you're an important cause to us, which is why we want to give you a platform. And we're going to be doing a lot together in the months and in the years ahead because this is a critically important issue for America, whether it's economically, whether it's for investors looking how to position themselves in this green economy of the future, such as it is, or whatever the case may be. So you live in Duluth, and when you started Better in Our Backyard, you were pretty much Duluth and Iron Range focused, not only the former Polymet, which again is now North Range Copper and Nickel, correct, is the name of the
Uh,
entity locally?
Actually, it's known as New Range Copper Nickel. And
New
it's a
Range,
yes,
North
yeah.
Range.
No, sorry to correct you. No,
All right,
it's a even joint venture between Glencore and Teck. And so
right.
two pretty big companies that are a part of it that are backing this project, and they're going full steam ahead. They've unfortunately faced some delays, and as you were saying earlier, they've definitely have been in the process for a long time. I mean, people have known about the deposit since the 90s, as you were talking about, and they've been in the permitting process now approaching nearly 20 years. And to your point earlier, when I started at Better in Our Backyard roughly 5 years ago, um, our main focus was promoting the NorthMet project and promoting projects like Enbridge's Line 3 replacement project with a focus on young professionals and doing events at colleges. And then after my first year, when COVID hit, there was always a vision in my head of what this could be because of the name and just because of just noticing that there's issues with permitting across the country. And when COVID hit, it kind of gave us some flexibility, if you will, to try different things. And now because of the different things that we tried during COVID, that's the model that you see today, which is a strong focus on social media. Our mission is to be the leader in advocating for responsible industrial development. And the model that we developed that was birthed 5 years ago because of projects like NorthMet and Enbridge's Line 3 replacement project and Twin Metals, Minnesota, has now allowed us to expand into Wisconsin and Michigan a few years back. So we went from being a Minnesota focused group to an upper Midwest group. And now recently we brought in a project called Perpetual Resources Stibnite Gold Project out of Idaho. And we've also picked up Resolution Copper out of Arizona to help advocate for their projects. And so we're essentially a national group now. But I'm still in Duluth. We still have a strong focus in Minnesota, but it's a little fun to bring in some of the national piece a little bit too, and some of our talking points.
Well, and it's good that you've been able to get out and give this message to a wider audience and start to go to a national audience. It was great to have you, for example, back earlier this winter on a panel with you and myself and David Tice, another one of our causes here at Strategic Media, with his documentary on the vulnerability of our power grid. A lot of these things overlap, pardon me, that we need to be able to be more insular is not the right word, but we need to take our destiny into our own hands. We shouldn't be reliant, for example, on China as we are for some of the electronics in power grids and even in our surveillance and national defense, any more than we should be relying on them or anybody else for the metals that we need for EV batteries and that type of thing. But we are dependent on these things. And so, you and David and I had a great reception at the conference that we were at in Miami earlier this winter. You've gotten out. You and I were just at a conference together in New York talking about the critical trends in mining finance put on by the New York chapter of the SME. They're a North American organization that, again, is all about the nuts and bolts of our extractive industries, from mining things in the ground up to making them a part of our power grid and energy and infrastructure and so forth. So you started in Minnesota with, you mentioned Enbridge, you mentioned Polymet, or the former Polymet. I just, habits die hard. I still call them Polymet.
Yeah, no, I have that issue too sometimes. So admitting,
And just next door to them, to the northeast, pretty much, is the Twin Metals project. One of the challenges that you and everybody in the Iron Range has had is that President Biden, when he was a candidate for president, literally came to the Iron Range campaigning, The trivia question for those of you folks who don't know this, Minnesota has the only Democrat party among the 50 states not called the Democrat Party. It's the DFL party, Democrat Farmer and Labor Party. And it goes back, I won't get into all of this now for present purposes, but some cool history of how it became the Democrat Farmer and Labor Party. But as the name implies, Democrats in Minnesota are not like Democrats in San Francisco or New York. Democrats in Minnesota are all about jobs, the economy, bread and butter, middle class kind of issues. And candidate Biden came to your neighborhood, Ryan, and lionized these two projects specifically, PolyMet, NorthMet and Twin Metals both, that they had a big part of the metals that we're going to need for the energy transition. And isn't this great? He becomes president and kills both of them. Twin Metals outright, that's still in court, I believe, right now, correct?
Yes. Yep. Yeah. It's
And
yeah. Yep.
yeah, and in the case of NorthMet, ever more roadblocks. I mean, how many times you have to jump through the same hoops? And this is something where at the conferences we've been at recently, the one you were at with me in New York, the one I was at a few weeks previously in Washington, this is becoming more and more apparent in a broader way, not necessarily to the general public yet, but to industry, to politicians. China's eating our lunch still on so many issues. We cannot compete against them globally, let alone build our own green economy of the future, our own infrastructure, what we need to build and rebuild and so forth. When we have layer upon layer upon layer of redundant permitting process, we allow people that don't live in the area, that have nothing to do with it economically, to file lawsuits just to stop it, just because they can do it. This has got to change. So what I want to go down this road just for a couple of minutes, Ryan. When those decisions came, those actions came from the Biden administration and specifically the Interior Department, what was the reaction of people up in the Iron Range specifically, and people maybe in northern Minnesota more generally? Did they think that, oh, gee, well, this is our president, it's okay? Or what happened?
Well, I'd say obviously there was extreme disappointment outside of the urban areas. So, just for some background, the Iron Range, and I'm assuming most of your audience knows that already anyways, but we've been mining iron ore for over 140 years, and we're still safely and responsibly mining iron ore to this day, or taconite mining. And for years or for decades, or, we've known that we have an abundance of copper, nickel, and cobalt and platinum group metal resources. So, and within the Duluth complex, and it's estimated that we have a third of the U.S. copper reserves, roughly 80% of U.S. cobalt reserves, and roughly 95% of U.S. nickel reserves, and the other 5% that's currently known is being mined by Michigan's Eagle Mine. So once they run out of ore, which might happen in the next couple of years, Minnesota is quite literally the last stand in terms of having an abundance of nickel in the U.S. And to answer your question, yeah, when Biden came in the campaign, to his credit, he never specifically mentioned the Twin Metals project. He never really specifically mentioned the NorthMet project, but he definitely hinted at it. And so it definitely took a lot of people by surprise. Unfortunately, even some of the labor unions, both of these projects, when they're going to be built, have what they call a PLA agreement. So, or a project labor agreement, which essentially means that when these projects are built, it's all going to be done by union labor. So there was a lot of his own supporters that were disappointed by these decisions. NorthMet had a permit revoked a couple of years ago. Twin Metals obviously now is they had their leases withdrawn. These are really good projects. I mean, if Twin Metals were up and running today, that's 750 permanent jobs that would be created overnight. The same goes with the NorthMet project. It would create over 300 permanent jobs if it was up and running today. So we're talking over 1,000 jobs a year that are kind of on the line, I should say, that pay over $100,000 a year on average. And that's not including some of the incidental jobs. Kind of the rule of thumb economically in Minnesota, and I would say across the country, is that for every mining job that you create roughly 2 to 3 other incidental jobs in the region. So we're talking thousands of good paying jobs that have been hindered. And also historically with northeastern Minnesota's population, you look at some communities like Ely, Minnesota, it's dropped by its population has dropped by roughly 34% in the last 40 years. And Hoyt Lakes, Minnesota, I think is above 20%. And Hoyt Lakes is right next to the NorthMet project. And while the rest of Minnesota has grown by 25%, but they're all going to urban areas. They're either going to southern Minnesota or northeastern Minnesota. So economically, it was definitely a cut at the knees a little bit when these projects were delayed, and obviously not current economics, because these projects aren't up and running, construction isn't happening, but it's definitely stifling the potential of the Iron Range. And it's my personal opinion. It's partly why I love doing what I do. I think the Iron Range has the most potential economically out of any other region in the state of Minnesota, and quite possibly the Midwest.
Oh, I don't think there's any question about that. And beyond the jobs, directly and indirectly, as you pointed out, Ryan, you're talking about a major boost to America's ability to control our own destiny when it comes to the supply of these things. I mean, it is outlandish in my view. And I know that in the position that you're in and dealing with a lot of elected officials and regulators, you sometimes have to weigh your words carefully, but I'll come out and say it, that it's absolutely insane that rather than support these types of projects, this administration instead would rather get cobalt from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, literally under labor standards that were outlawed in this country generations ago. After Pope Francis, a year or so ago, pointed to this very thing and said this kind of exploitation has got to end, where you literally have children up to their armpits in muck and chemicals, physically by hand, mining the cobalt and other stuff that goes into your EV. I mean, that's the height of hypocrisy. It's a lot of things. And then on a nickel score, of course, Biden has made very clear that he wants to import more nickel, not less, from Indonesia. And this is a source of nickel that's the dirtiest in the world, and which the EU has already put a date on, after which they will not allow nickel imports from Indonesia. So it just goes to show that for all of the talk of wanting to have this green economy and whatnot, and we've seen this recently in just one example with the electric vehicle industry really running into a wall. There's been, the U.S. has seen most or all of the sales it's going to of electric vehicles because of subsidies and or because of people who want to buy it as their own woke status symbol. Now they're going to have to be done based on competitiveness, cost effectiveness, and so forth. And we cannot have a cost-effective EV industry ever in this country if these are the policies that we're going to pursue, not allowing the building blocks in our own backyard. So that you don't have to respond necessarily, Ryan. That's just my
Oh, no,
part
and,
is.
and to add to your point, I mean, it's not, I think, I don't even take it as you're really bashing the administration. I mean, you kind of are, but it's also the truth. I mean, I mean, you look at, and I just look at it from a leadership perspective. These minerals are critical to our national security and to our green energy. And I just think of it from a policy perspective. If I'm a policymaker and I'm pushing these technologies, whether you agree with the renewable energy sector or not, whether you think you should grow or not, if I'm seeing windmill, like let's say if I'm the governor of Minnesota, I'm Governor Tim Walz, and I'm seeing windmills go up in Minnesota, I'm seeing solar panels put on roofs on public projects. I kind of want to go to sleep at night knowing that there's a good chance that the copper came from my home state, or that the nickel for some of these EV batteries or some of these electric vehicles that are driving through Minnesota came from my home state. So that not only did we, push the policies that we wanted, but some of the minerals and materials that we needed for them were birthed in Minnesota or started in Minnesota and created some good paying jobs, and quite specifically in many cases union jobs in Minnesota. And I'd say that's for across the country. I mean, we've seen a lot of investment because of the Inflation Reduction Act go into the manufacturing side of this, which has been great for the US in terms of creating jobs, but we're missing that raw materials portion. We should be working as much as possible to make sure that we can get as much cobalt and nickel starting here in the US to be put into for manufacturing facilities when they're building their EV batteries in Tennessee or Michigan. We should try to keep the supply chain closer to home as much as possible. And when you look at the reserves in the US, we can't supplement our own nickel and cobalt demand, but we can certainly get it from countries like Canada or even Australia. But I would argue that we should put ourselves first. And in terms of copper too, I mean, when you combine us between Minnesota and the copper state and Arizona and what we're seeing with existing production over at Kennecott in Utah, the U.S. could be copper independent if we were to actually permit some of these projects across the country. So no, I think all you're saying right now is the truth. And And I do have hope personally that the administration is going to change their stance on this, because I think, as you alluded to earlier, I think there are many that are waking up to this fact that, it is unethical to push these policies and look the other way when Indonesia is practicing deforestation to get the nickel needed for EV batteries. Or, as to what you're saying, we're employing, the more that we turn our eyes away from the Democratic Republic of Congo, there's going to be more, child labor employed. So I think some people are waking up to it, and slowly but surely, I think this is becoming a bipartisan issue.
Well, it certainly is, and I don't want this to be all bad news, folks. We're going to talk about some accomplishments, but one of them, you and I were together last week in New York City, the week before Memorial Day. But a few weeks before that, I was at a conference in Washington, D.C., where they also had, as in New York, a few members of the administration that were there, the Energy Department, the Defense Department, and so forth, where there has been some funding of different projects. And one of the people, I don't remember which agency she was with, was actually refreshingly forthright in talking about our challenges, because I do think when you get underneath the president and some of his more activist, anti-extractive industry cabinet members and hangers on, you get down into these agencies, even in his administration, and some of these people really do get it and really understand the job that needs to be done that isn't being done. And this gal said, and I'm basically paraphrasing it, that we're in trouble as a country when it takes so many years to permit anything new. We've got these multiplied layers of agencies and whatnot. You and I saw in New York the same chart I saw a few weeks earlier in Washington, where it showed the flow chart from the administration on down and through all these different agencies and whatnot, who does this, who oversees this, who passes muster on this, and so forth, with critical metals. And it's a maze. It's ridiculous. And basically what she said is, it's no wonder that we can't keep up with China, because China, and this is not said to forgive how they cut corners environmentally and pollution wise and otherwise, because we don't want to go that far. But that aside, she basically said that, look, China just looks at the landscape. Here's our goal. We want so many EVs. We want to reduce internal combustion engines. Half of the vehicle sales in China now are electric vehicles. They've already met President Biden's stated goal many years ahead of him. And Biden has not given us the tools that meet his objectives here. But they look at what they need to do to accomplish the objective, and they do it. You don't have all of this hand-wringing and layer upon layer upon layer of regulations doing the same thing over again, in some cases multiple times, and it's no wonder. So at that Washington conference, two things happened, or during that Washington conference. One is, and this is, I think, the best thing that the president and his administration have done. They got the Russian uranium ban off the ground. So now we're going to be a lot more energetic in making sure that in the nuclear energy industry, which this country pioneered many decades back, we're going to be king of the hill again. And we're going to do it with domestic uranium, domestic enrichment, domestic technology, and so forth. That's a great thing. The other thing they did at that Washington conference was the Energy Department announced that they will now see as eligible actual mining activities for some of this federal money. Previous to that, mining was off the table. You had this thing, they wanted to put the cart before the horse. They want to build charging stations. They can't even do that right. As we heard from the transportation secretary on one of the Sunday talk shows recently, that they, for $7.5 billion, don't have many charging stations to show for all of that money, let alone the EVs to charge, going forward. But they're finally realizing that they have to start catching up with these upstream sources and be a lot more serious about having these metals come from domestic sources and or friendly sources, and not from the unfriendly ones like we've been doing. So anyway, you talk about the IRA yourself. I know that Talon Metals has been an interesting story, where the market still doesn't really give them a whole lot of credit for their deposit, but Talon Metals in Minnesota at least has been one that has gotten some help from the government. Tell us a little bit about that story.
Well, yeah, no, when you bring up a great point too, Chris, to add to some of your points, that I failed to mention earlier too, and I try to make sure that they get credit where credit's due, is that especially the Department of Defense, and includes Talon, and that's going to lead me into this a little bit, is the Department of Defense has done a great job in supporting critical mineral projects. They've supported Talon. They're doing some exploration drilling both in Minnesota and Michigan. They recently just announced that they're helping out South 32, which is right now it's the only advanced project that's targeting two critical minerals between zinc and manganese, in Arizona. And they've
In
also
South
helped out.
32, yeah. Okay, that's in
Yep, yeah,
Arizona.
Hermosa project. And then they've also, they also have done a good job of assisting Perpetua Resources. They're trying to, the gold on that project for Stibnite Gold project is what's going to cash flow the project, but it's the antimony on site that's going to get it permitted, hopefully, because we need it for our munition supply and military applications. And they've also done a good job of supporting projects like Graphite One out of Alaska. So to your point, they've done a great job, and now the Department of Energy now is open to supporting mining projects. They've given a pretty friendly loan to Lithium Americas out of Nevada a few months back. And then also too, they've even helped out Talon Metals, and that adds into the story of Talon, is that they're helping them build their processing facility in North Dakota, or helping them with a grant. So Talon, as far as I know, is the only project right now that has been supported by both the Department of Energy and the Department of Defense to the state. And right now, Talon is targeting a high grade nickel and cobalt deposit in north central Minnesota. There's also some copper too there as well. And I'm not a nickel expert by any means, but from my understanding with the deposit, that when you put in a core and you come out with 1% nickel, that's considered high grade. And Talon is finding core grade samples. It's a smaller deposit. These are small pockets that they're finding of anywhere from 6 to 10%. Don't quote me on that, but that's from my understanding, staying updated with their team and looking at their press releases. So it's a very interesting project. They definitely have some work to do. I mean, they just started the permitting process last year, but Talon's a good one to watch for. Absolutely.
Good. Now, as we wind down, you've again started to spread your influence. You've been into Alaska, you've been to Idaho, you've been to Arizona. You're getting involved more and more with the national organizations that follow extractive industries and some of these things. We've collaborated on a few of those together. So, what do you see, Ryan, going forward? Do you think that with some of these projects that have been funded recently, that even this administration is waking up? Have we turned a corner to where we can expect to see more aggressive support? So I guess that's the first part of my question. Do you think that some of these moves by the administration recently have been legitimate?
I do. And well, yeah, I would say, because you got to think that, and I'm not, and maybe I should speak on my behalf when I say this, but I look at it just very simply in the terms that if I'm the president, or say the boss, if you will, of some of these agencies, that's kind of embarrassing if I'm having my agencies loan money to some of these companies and they don't end up getting permitted. So I think they're being very serious when they're backing some of these projects. And but I think time will tell. And one thing to mention too, when I mentioned South 32's Hermosa's project, they were added to the Fast 41 program, I believe, last year. And the Fast 41 program is basically legislation that was designed to streamline infrastructure projects. So the Hermosa project is essentially the first mining project to be added to that program, so they can get permitted in a timely fashion. And when you read up on Fast 41, it basically sounds like what some senators like Joe Manchin want to do in terms of implementing comprehensive permitting reform for some of these large mining projects. And I believe that once Hermosa proves that you can actually permit a project in a timely fashion and still mine responsibly, that's really going to open up everyone's eyes to, okay, maybe it shouldn't take over a decade to permit a project that would be good for the country.
Right. And I think that that's starting to come along. There's been, I know, multiple attempts in the House and Senate, both in Washington, to do some streamlining of this. Hasn't really borne a whole lot of fruit yet, but I do think that the signs have grown that these are percolating. It's between both Democrats and Republicans, so that's a good thing. I guess lastly, Ryan, beyond the companies involved, beyond trying to get more legislators and regulators to understand this, what are your I guess accomplishments and challenges, both as far as the general public is concerned? I mean, does the Joe Sixpack and Sally Soccer Mom sitting in their living room watching the evening news, whether it's in the Iron Range where maybe it's a little bit more likely, or if it's in St. Paul where they don't pay any attention to these things at all. Have you seen any inroads to where the general public gets this and realizes that we need to have our own control over our own building blocks and control of our own destiny, really?
It's a great question. I think so. I mean, a lot of our outreach is digital via social media, and then we do events every quarter. And a lot of people that admittingly that already follow us understand these issues. But my best case study actually is when I'm talking with family members that follow my page or follow Better in Our Backyards page, I should say, or some of my friends that we might disagree politically on these issues, but they're kind of opening up their eyes a little bit. I'm like, oh, I didn't know that fact about cobalt, or I didn't know that about nickel. I didn't realize all these minerals go into our phones. So a lot of times I go from that, and when especially with some of my friends that disagree with me on 90% of things, and they're kind of scratching their head a little bit, if you will, saying, wow, I didn't know that, or I didn't know that. That kind of tells me, all right, our messaging is on point, because we want to. My goal is to remain, bipartisan as possible on these issues when politics come in, which unfortunately politics play a big role in some of these projects. But as long as we're staying bipartisan and staying factual, and our messaging is built on integrity, it should continue to work.
That's good. Well, folks, I can't stress enough that you really need to get to know Ryan and Better in Our Backyard. Follow them. They are extremely active on social media. We follow one another, and we're probably trading things directly or indirectly almost on a daily basis. They put out a lot of great stuff, a lot of great statistics, and support them. Go to their website, follow them. You're most active, I think, really on LinkedIn, correct, Ryan?
LinkedIn and Facebook. The algorithms on Facebook have been funky lately. We messed around a little bit on TikTok, and then we have some work to do in growing our following on Instagram and Twitter, but we'll get there. I'll probably have to get another intern or two to make that happen.
Mostly LinkedIn and Facebook.
Yes. Yeah. Yep.
Okay. All right. So make sure you follow him, learn more about him, and please make yourself better informed. We're here to help you do some of that. So make sure that you keep up with us as well. If you're not already on our general email list, make sure you get on it, so that we can keep you up to date on a lot of these public policy issues. But again, this is something that transcends party. Doesn't matter whether you're left, right, center, up, down. We either have the building blocks that we need to be an independent nation when it comes to our energy grid, when it comes to our energy future, our infrastructure, all these things, or we don't. And it's not a good position to be in not to have that. And when we especially have within our own four walls the ability, with copper, we could be completely independent copper-wise. We can be a lot more independent nickel-wise, and with so many other of these critical metals that the government acknowledges are critical for our future. More and more, I think we need to wake up to the fact that we can produce these things in our own backyard, help our economy, do these things with first world wages, first world environmental standards, and the rest. I think it's personally a no-brainer. So, Ryan, thanks for your time today. Keep up the good work, and we'll certainly keep in touch.
I appreciate that, Chris. Thank you for having me again.
We hope you got a lot out of today's subject. Make sure you avail yourself of the resources and contacts offered today. Subscribe to this channel for future topics and opportunities. And if you have any questions, drop us a line. Thanks for tuning in.